Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Writers Unblocked Artist Interview Inspiration Series. I'm here with my guest, award-winning author, educator, writing enthusiast, and publishing machine, Mr. Howard Shrier. Howard, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. Now, so what I have on you right now, you're the winner of the Arthur Ellis Award for Best Novel. Is that still the name of the award, or has that since
Uh, I
changed?
okay, so Arthur Ellis was a pseudonym for the
Yep.
hangman in Canada when there was still capital punishment. And about 4 years ago, some people said, well, maybe we shouldn't name it after a guy who was the hangman. So I think it's just called now the Crime Writers of Canada Award of Excellence.
Uh,
I actually won it twice, once for Best First Novel
mm,
and the following year for Best Novel. I believe I'm still the only person to have done that.
Consecutively, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. So I believe the first one was for Buffalo Jump,
Yes.
where we get our introduction into the character Jonah Geller. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yep. And then the sequel, High Chicago. Yeah, I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure as I've checked to this day, you are the only author to win that consecutively, which has got to be an amazing feat.
It was pretty great, and it came on my
Mhm.
son's birthday. It was May 27th, so
Wow.
of 2010, I guess. So it's been a little while, but it
Mhm.
came on his 13th birthday, so that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. What better birthday gift?
Yeah.
Taught creative writing at University of Toronto for 9 years, and
Yeah.
currently you're still a publishing machine and helping aspiring writers with their manuscripts and getting their works off the ground.
Yeah,
Correct?
I'm
Yeah.
teaching an online course right now. I have students from California, New Jersey, Mexico City, Ottawa, Toronto, and a couple of other places, and we meet online once a week.
Wow.
Talk about different aspects of writing and review manuscripts. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, and I go to writers' festivals where I do workshops, master classes, different things. So I've been teaching, I guess, about 16 years now, and I love it.
That's amazing. Is writing generally universal, or are you finding anything different based on the demographics of your students?
I think there are aspects of it that are universal.
Mhm.
I think where somebody grew up, how they grew up, will often affect maybe their cadence, their
Sure.
style, the dialogue they use for their characters. It's in fact that's one of the modules in my course is understanding dialogue, how it has to reflect each person uniquely because we all speak differently. The internet has flattened that out a bit, and cable TV has flattened that out a bit. When
Yep.
I was growing up, people's accents were much more obvious, and
Sure.
now I think we're coming back to the center a little bit on that.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So, first question, always like to ask, writers and artists that come on, where did your love of writing begin?
As a reader,
Yeah.
I was, I think, a precocious and voracious reader. I started
Mhm.
young. I loved books. Um, I loved everything. Tarzan of the Apes was one of my favorite books growing up. But I
Classic.
just read a lot, and
Mhm.
the more I read, the more I guess I became attuned with language,
Mhm.
and and seeing it as something that could be used in such beautiful ways. The other side of that coin, I don't know if you know the author Dennis Lehane. He wrote Mystic River, great novel, and
Okay.
quite a few others. I saw him on a panel once, and someone said, Dennis, why'd you become a writer? And he said in his adorable Boston accent, I sucked at everything else. I was not a good student,
Mhm.
although my teachers all said he's really bright. He just doesn't
Mhm.
apply himself, that old thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wasn't a great athlete. I was a decent but not great musician. And
Mhm.
and eventually writing, I realized it was the one thing I could do where I stood out and
Yeah.
I could do better than most people.
Mhm.
And I came to it pretty quickly. I practically flunked out of high school,
Mhm.
and then when I went to university after a year off, and I somehow found my way into journalism and creative writing, and I
Wow.
finished at the top.
Mhm.
I exploded. I
Mhm.
was like a boy in love with
Yeah.
language,
Mhm.
and I couldn't read enough. I couldn't write enough. And it's been that way ever since.
Now, understandably, others will have different experiences and other opportunities based on where they are, what their school system is. Would
Yeah.
you say that your success in finding your love and passion for writing came in spite of the schooling that you had, or was it just not a time in your life that you were at yet?
Yeah, high school was not my shining moment. My parents split up right at the beginning of
Yeah.
ninth grade. I was
Mhm.
distracted. I was starting to, smoke too much pot and all that stuff that
Who wouldn't?
kids go through when there are abrupt and unwanted change.
Mhm.
So even if they had good programs or instruction, I was just in a world of my
Yeah,
own. But
sure.
I had a couple of teachers in university who were great,
Good.
um, who fired up that love of language, who encouraged me, saw something in me that I was only just starting to see for myself,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that was always, of course, a great help.
Absolutely. Now, you once said in an interview that your inspiration for writing came from your shift from being a doer to an observer, and that kids would often laugh at you, or at the things that you were writing back in school.
Yeah.
So, what kinds of things were you writing that prompted such a response?
It was often about the other kids in class, like
Oh,
we
okay,
we
that's
have to write a
justified.
composition. I would write something about, what the guys were doing.
Yeah.
Um, it's the Canadian system might be a little bit different from the American,
Mm,
but at the end of high school, we had exams called matriculations, and those were for the entire province of Quebec, and you were then compared, put into uh, quintiles and everything. And my marks in most things were like mediocre, mediocre, mediocre. But in English composition, I
mhm.
was 97, percentile. Just so, I mean, it was clear that, as one teacher said, you don't have much to say, but you say it really well. uh, so, all of those things just kind of snowballed into,
Mhm.
finally saying, wait, like I could actually do this for a living.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
so
And I've noticed, at least going through your work, that your inspiration seems to come either through fragmented sentences or experiences that you're having. Like I remember back, I'm just going to throw out a sentence. Let me know if this means anything to you and what this means to you. He walked with a step that belied his 60 years.
ha.
What does that
So
mean to you?
it was the first thing I ever wrote with intention.
Yep.
I was working in a factory, shipping department, putting coats in boxes, and it was almost like hearing a voice in my head. He walked with a step that belied his 60, and it wouldn't go away until I
Hmm.
got one of those. You may not remember this, you might be too young, but those pink memo slips that were in offices, and while you were
Hmm.
out, this person called, and I
Yep.
got it. I turned it over and wrote on the back, and I kept going till I filled about 6 or 7, and that
Wow.
became my first story. And it was
Unbelievable.
hokey, and it was melodramatic, and silly. And if I found it today, I'd probably laugh myself into stitches. But we all have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And I wrote probably a dozen stories. I was about 19, I guess. And the 13th one was good.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
you have to do that and get all the junk out of your
Hmm.
system until you finally, like Hemingway said, write something that's true.
Hmm.
Write something that really moves you, makes you feel something. And that was kind of the beginning. And then I got into a creative writing program. And again, some of the first ones were junk, but
Hmm.
the last one was good.
That's great.
Yeah.
Now, is that generally how your stories come, through fragmented ideas that just pop up, or a scene that you might have in your head and then everything blossoms from that?
Each one has been a little bit different. The first book, Buffalo Jump, was a premise.
Mhm.
What if? And I always tell
Yep.
students those are two of the most powerful words
Mhm.
a
Yep.
writer has. What if?
Mhm.
And I loved crime fiction. That was my thing. from a young age. It spoke to me in ways that some other types of literature didn't. And I thought, what if a hitman was given a contract he did not want to fulfill because it involved killing a boy the same age as his son?
Right.
And he had to go to a private eye to get help. He had to basically hire this private investigator, Jonah Geller, to find out who put out the contract and get them to take the boy off the table. He said, I'll kill the father. If I have to, I'll kill the mother. I don't like doing women, but if I have to, I will. But I'm not doing a kid. I don't have much of my soul left. This is about it. And if I do this, I'm done. And that's the beginning of this kind of bizarre friendship between Jonah Geller and this hitman, Dante Ryan. And they wind up together in all 4 of the books in that series.
Now, when you come up with a character like Jonah Geller, who has been contracted to figure out exactly why or who put this hit out on this 5-year-old, is it hard to come up, because he's kind of an out-of-body character for the person who's having the moral dilemma? Was it hard to kind of come up with a character arc for Jonah Geller? Because it's still more of a job. Is there an emotional stake that needs and wants that he's dealing with as well?
Yes. I purposely started the book with Jonah at a low point in his life. He screwed up his last case, and someone was shot and paralyzed because of it. He was shot as well, but not as seriously. His girlfriend dumped him, and the boss at the agency where he works has him in the doghouse. He has an older brother who's successful, married, children, pillar of the community. Jonah is none of these. He's like I was at a point in my life where my mother kept saying, what's going to be with you? You know, so he has a lot to prove to himself. And he also, I mean, he's horrified by the idea that somebody would want a child killed for whatever reason. And in fact, he keeps pushing Dante Ryan to find more of his moral center. He keeps saying to him, aim higher, you know, like we can't let this happen. So between wanting to prove himself, whether to his mother, to his boss, to his older brother, to the world in general, that, hey, I'm a good person too. I may not have taken he's Jewish, as am I, you know, so I may not have taken the traditional doctor, lawyer, you know, accountant path in life, the approved professions. You know, we used to joke that our parents gave us free reign as far as what you wanted to do with your life. You could be a doctor or a lawyer. You know, like, there's your choice. So, you know, because I was, you know, a bit of the screw up and didn't pursue any of those traditional pathways and wasn't married, didn't have kids until later. Jonah is, you know, the thing that Jorge Luis Borges once said about him and his characters. I am Borges, but Borges is not me. Jonah Geller is me, but I am not him. He's me if I were younger, fitter, stronger, braver.
Gotcha.
But he's got my outlook. He has my humor. He has, you know, my sort of Jewish atheist outlook on life. So it was always fun for me to be in his shoes as I was writing each book, because we were like this.
I assume you had to extract a lot from personal experiences and just, you know, probably juxtaposed a lot of yourself into this character, because this character clearly meant a lot to you, so much so that you have 4 books solely based around him. Are we expecting to see Mr. Jonah Geller for a 5th?
At this point, no, but I'd never say never. I felt like I had kind of exhausted some of what there was to be done with him, with Ryan, with his partner, Jen. And I wanted to move on to some other things. So, but I feel like every character, there's some of me in them, because, you know, as you're writing a character and you want to talk about their love, their inspiration, their disappointment, their, you know, their grief, their
Sure.
despair. I mean, you kind of reach into yourself and how would I feel if I was in that
Hmm.
situation? And in my younger days, I did take a break from writing and I went
Hmm.
back to school to study theater. And I did a year in Montreal and then a year in New York City at Circle in the Square in the
Okay.
professional workshop. And
Wow.
that theater experience also gave me tools, I suppose, to try to put myself into the shoes of the characters I write about.
Hmm. And that actually brings up an even larger point. Is How important is experience in writing? Is it possible for somebody with minimal experience to be able to sensibly write emotions for a character or a story?
You know, I think depending on the kind of book they want to write, there are obviously
Right.
writers in this world who've had great success when they were young.
Mhm.
And if it is talking about emotion, I mean, we feel and understand emotion from a pretty young age, and even
Mhm.
someone in their teens can have fairly, I'd say, deep feelings and maybe a pretty keen understanding of
Mhm.
feelings, relationships, what people do to each other. Things like a crime novel or novels about the wider world, I think you do need a lot of experience, research,
Mhm.
because you have to be convincing, not always realistic, but plausible about the
Mhm.
things you're writing about. So
Yeah.
before I wrote one word of Buffalo Jump, I did about a year of research, notes, scene building, world building, character building, until I felt like I knew enough to start a
Mhm.
draft.
Yeah, absolutely. Deep
Yeah.
feelings from high school kids. That's
Yes. Yeah.
unheard of.
Yeah.
I'd go as far as to say that their feelings are almost apocalyptic at times.
Yes. That's right. That's right. Now I have two sons, but my friends that have girls, who have said like in high school,
Mhm.
it's like volcanic. I mean,
Mhm.
you know, between bullying and boys and appearances and rules and all that
Mhm.
stuff. Yeah, I
Mhm.
mean the feelings we have as we're becoming adults,
Yep.
they're on fire and they're never far from the surface.
Mhm. And that's one of my favorite themes to write with is loss of innocence and coming of age.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there's such an interesting transitionary window that you can work with there.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I'm always interested in the idea of writers and artists as observers and interpreters. So, someone's
Yeah.
experience could very well define the interpretation of what they are observing. So, you as a writer, what's your approach to observing potential material? Do you try to maintain an objective lens or do you immediately filter it through personal experience and opinion?
I would say more the second than the first.
Sure.
But I do think the first thing a writer has to do is train themselves to be observers. And it's not always fun. I mean, like other people are out, experiencing life and doing
Hmm.
things. And sometimes you're on the sidelines going, uh-huh,
Hmm.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
But I think either you're born that way or your early experience makes you that way. My mother
Hmm.
used to say, I didn't start talking till I was 2.5. And then I
Sure.
started in full sentences. And it was
Hmm.
almost like I was hanging back until I could either have something to say or be
Hmm.
able to express it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think by nature, my parents were both, uh, court holders in a way, and my sister's older and, quite dominant. So I think I was kind of often just quietly looking out at the world. But
Yeah.
yes,
Absolutely.
filtering it sort of, what does this mean to me? How does this
Hmm.
line up with how I feel?
Exactly. Do you find that um, lens of going out and being an observer for your younger students, do you find that to be different than when you first started teaching or when you first started writing? Because I think immediately to going out and observing the world as much as you can, but the world once the birth of the algorithm came around, their world has gotten more and more personally shifted toward their own beliefs and biases.
100%. And I was talking about it just the other night when we did our module on dialogue.
Mhm.
And I said, one of the ways you can get better at dialogue is just eavesdrop on people, listen to
Yeah.
how they speak. But now,
Mhm.
like, I used to do that on the subway or on a bus, and now everyone's just looking at their phones. They're not
Yeah.
talking to each other, or they're,
Hmm.
they're wearing headphones. Um, it is harder, I think. People don't read as much, certainly not books. They may be reading Reddit or,
Yeah.
news, but like you said, the algorithms determine which news you get based on what you've selected before.
Yeah.
It was different when, like, I would hang out at a library or a used bookstore, which
Hmm.
those were my favorite places, and now they're dwindling kind of.
Hmm.
I loved going to used bookstores and finding, just novels to read, and cheap and cheerful, and
Hmm.
always had something going. Um, I think it is definitely getting harder,
Yeah.
even to find undiscovered places in the world.
Hmm.
The kind of places I went to when I was are overrun now. I mean, they're
Yeah.
crowded, and
Hmm.
they've lost their innocence, in a
Yeah.
way. They're commercialized. Everything's commercialized.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
not as
Absolutely.
easy as it.
I find it with a lot of the young writers that I see and just artists in general, with the market being as overly saturated as it is, because now everybody has a platform to not only act or, produce music, but write, finding a way to be unique while at the same time fighting those urges that a lot of the younger generations have now with algorithms being fed everything that they want to hear.
Yeah,
It's a lot harder to be able to verbalize conflict or put it on paper.
yeah.
Um, and that's just an interesting note that I've noticed a lot of young writers nowadays having trouble with.
Mhm.
Um, but also, I want to get to the crux of what this show is really about, and that in essence is writer's block.
Okay.
So, on the days, weeks, months, even years filled with nothing but unwavering writer's block, how do you address it?
So I have experienced it a couple of times,
Mhm.
but I would say, of the 7 books that I've written, um, there've only been a couple of times where it was, I really got thrown off.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes because there was a problem in the story that I hadn't yet solved,
Mhm.
and I was going, ugh, like, whoever thought this was a good idea. Um, Now, I devote one of my modules in my course to outlining,
Mhm.
and what I often say to people is, there's only one way to write a book, and that's
Mhm.
your way. That's whatever works for you. But here's what worked for me. And after numerous false starts and unfinished manuscripts, as I said, when I started Buffalo Jump, I had the instinct, don't start writing yet. Do the research.
Mhm.
Research about private eyes, research about the mob, research about pharmaceutical smuggling, about tobacco smuggling, and all the other plots and subplots that became part of the book. Um, and I would make notes. I would have these 200-page whatever
Oh, the
composition
classic
books.
composition. No, yeah, for the
Yeah,
audio listeners, the classic composition journal.
yeah, and I filled 3 of them with notes on this story I was trying to build, and
Mhm.
almost nothing from the first 2 notebooks made it in. Those were all the
Yeah.
bad ideas, and but when I got to the 3rd one, I finally was starting to get a good grasp on who Jonah Geller was, who Dante Ryan was, who the boys' family were, and who had put this hit out.
Mhm.
And um, the more I knew, the more I could outline and say, okay, like, not I didn't know every last moment of the book, but I had a
Mhm.
pretty good idea of the arc from where it starts, to the climax, and
Sure.
that kept me from getting blocked.
Good.
And so I preach this gospel to everyone, and I tell them how, God, in 1988, so we're talking a long time ago,
Mhm.
I went to a workshop with Robert McKee, who was a famous writing teacher. He's in the film adaptation played by Brian Cox.
Okay.
giving a screenplay workshop called Story, and that was a real
Wow.
thing. I went to Story with McKee, and he would say the same thing: outline, 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 build the spine of your story, and don't start writing until you really know where you're going. Then, when you're ready, it's going to come out like your hair's on fire,
Yeah.
and the dialogue will come out because people are dying to speak already, like they've been waiting.
Hmm.
um, and I went to this and I took notes, furious notes, for it was a weekend, from Friday to Sunday, and then I ignored it. I don't know why.
Yeah.
I was young. I was
Hmm.
I was impatient. I'd
Hmm.
get an idea and I go, oh, chapter one, and start writing.
Hmm.
And then 4 chapters later, I was blocked.
Yeah, burned
Somehow,
out.
when the idea for Buffalo Jump came along, and this is years later, I said, not so fast, Sparky. Slow
Hmm.
your roll. Uh, do the work.
Hmm.
Do this really important work. Get to know the characters. Get to know their world.
Yeah.
Uh, know what motivates them. Know where you want to go.
Hmm.
And lo and behold, then I worked on it for a few months, and there was a subplot about tobacco smuggling, which was a big thing in Canada at the time.
Okay.
Because the government raised taxes on cigarettes to the point where they were crazy expensive. So people were getting cigarettes from the States or whatever and selling them out of duffel bags in the bars, for $5 a pack.
Jesus.
So that was part of the subplot. And and they were coming in through a native reserve, which straddles New York, Ontario, and Quebec. So no border.
Okay.
And, um, and I had them and the mob, and I was having a hard time making the money angle work.
Hmm.
Unless they sold them for more than the market wanted to pay, there wasn't really enough profit for everybody. But I
Hmm.
wanted to keep the native reserve in. It's a Mohawk reserve. The culture is deep and brilliant and wonderful. I had a great
Hmm.
contact there, an old friend who lived there, who took me
Hmm.
around. It even had a defunct airstrip, which would have been perfect.
Hmm.
And I had done some research, and I did not want to cut it. But one
Hmm.
day, I was early in the morning, I was up, and as I was going to get my coffee, this voice in my head said, the Mohawks are out. It's just the mob now making the money. And as soon as I did that, I was
Hmm.
free. And I never stopped again until that book was published. But
Because there
here's,
was enough money now for everybody.
yes, but
Yeah.
the important thing was, if I had already written those scenes with the Mohawk schools and life and everything that was so rich, I would
Hmm.
never have been able to give it up. At this point, it was
Exactly.
just index cards or
Hmm.
notes in a notebook. So
Hmm.
that's why I tell people, before you start writing all these scenes, outline it first,
Hmm.
so that if you have to change direction, you just rip up one index card and start a new one.
Yeah.
Uh, and not only that, but I think that if you outline, you can take bigger chances, bigger leaps, bigger what ifs,
Hmm.
because you're not committing to writing it just yet. So,
Sure.
like, what if this crazy thing happens? And then you take some time and examine it. Does it hold up in the light of day? If it does,
Hmm.
great. You've just made your book better. If the next morning you wake up and say, you know what, it was a good idea, but it's not going to work. Okay, you're out one
Hmm.
index card. So to me, if you build your story first, you're giving yourself every opportunity to succeed, and you're lessening some of the opportunities to fail by painting yourself into a corner, by painting scenes that you'll never want to get rid of,
Hmm.
um, and by not going far out enough on a limb to
Hmm.
really explore the absolute craziest possibilities for your story.
Exactly. And the interesting about that is what happens when you have the scenes that work for you. You've gotten all the way to the point of finding an agent, shopping the manuscript around, and the agent challenges you. So, Buffalo Jump, you had said that your agent had asked for some serious revisions
Yes.
before shopping it around. How do you maintain your sense of self or your original vision for the story when now the person
Yeah.
who's tasked with shopping your story around is asking for changes to your work?
Well, I'll tell you what that experience was like. So first of all, I did what every writer should do. I researched agents.
Sure.
I looked at some of the writers who were kind of doing what I wanted to do and who's their agent. And they always thank them in the
Mm,
acknowledgments, or you
yeah.
can look it up, in various websites and databases. And I found that this one person represented two writers that were both in Toronto. And I thought I fall somewhere in there. One was writing
Okay.
very humorous stuff. One was writing a little darker, more poetic stuff. I thought I
Mhm.
can kind of fit somewhere in there. I want her to be my agent. And I sent
Okay.
her, I was able to get her to read a sample, and she liked it. And I sent her the whole manuscript. She said, let's meet. And we met at a
Great.
restaurant just down the street from my house. And she's very blunt. This person
Well,
does not mince words. She
with the
said,
the number of manuscripts she's probably thrown. Yeah.
exactly. And, she said, I love your character. I love Jonah. I love your voice. I love your writing. And I'm sitting there going, whoa, whoa, whoa. The
Yeah.
story, she said, man.
The
And I was
thing
like,
I'm presenting you with.
what?
Yeah.
400 pages, 2.5
Yeah.
years.
Mhm.
She said, it's not a whodunit. It's a thriller without thrills. It doesn't
Wow.
have, she said, there's a lot of this. People
Yeah.
get together, they talk. People get
Mhm.
together, they talk. There's no action. There's no you know, great fight scenes, chases, like the kind of,
Yeah.
some of the things that, a crime novel needs, climaxes.
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you willing
God,
to?
did she make you pick up the check too?
No, thank God.
Jesus.
But she said, "Are you willing to write it?" And
Mm,
we kicked around a couple of ideas, um, based on some of my experience, places I'd worked, things I had done, and I said, "Well, let me sleep on it." So I came home. I told my wife. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, I can always go back to the version I have now if
mhm,
if I'm not happy. But she's offering me a bigger sandbox to play in. She's a
mhm.
serious agent, and if she does take me on, there's a pretty good chance I can get this published. So I slept on it, and Chris, I woke up the next morning bursting with ideas for how to rewrite it. So I knew that I was on the right course. And
Yeah.
now I didn't think it was going to go on as long as it did, 14
Mm.
months. And every
Wow.
time I would rewrite it and send it to her and wait, and sometimes I had to wait longer than I wanted to. And she'd say, not quite there yet,
Mhm,
not quite there yet. But when she finally said, you know, I'm sending it out, within
mhm.
2 months, I got an offer for a 2-book deal from Random House.
Wow.
So it
Wow.
was worth every bit of angst, and there was angst.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mhm,
at one point, I was calling her because I hadn't heard this or that, and at
mhm.
one point she said, "Jesus, I don't know if I'm the agent for you. Like, you got to come in off the ledge."
Yeah.
Uh, so but I'm not going to say I was young. I wasn't that young, but I was inexperienced.
Mhm,
I didn't know exactly how long things took, when it
mhm.
came to publishers and making decisions, etc. But it worked out.
Do you think the amount of time that it took to rewrite it and finally get it shopped around, is that mainly because she wanted the story to be written, or she knew what publishers wanted in terms of longevity in stories?
I would say a bit of both.
Yeah.
She was a very successful agent. She had a lot of clients getting good deals, so she knew what, and a lot of them were being published by Random House. So
Mhm.
I think she had a very good relationship there, and knew what they wanted, but also knew I could do better. But the great thing is that the next book, she had very little input, and the editor at Random House did High Chicago very little. Like I was kept looking for the red ink, and there was hardly any. I remember the third book, which is called Boston Cream, about organ theft. She felt that I was skating a bit, my agent, and said, you need to go deeper. Maybe you need to go darker, because it feels surface. And I think in many ways it's the best book. You know, High Chicago's funnier, Buffalo Jump's funnier, Miss Montreal's funnier, but Boston Cream has something that I love. It's definitely, you know, up there for me.
Deeper and darker makes me laugh because I've always heard from people that to be a successful writer and to have profitable returns from your story arcs and have things tie up nicely, if you are going to do a positive change arc, we as writers need to be pretty sadistic to our characters, to be willing to put them through just absolute heaven and hell to get to where they need to be, to force that evolutionary change.
Yes.
And you sit back and you say, like, I love this character so much, and yet I'm the one hurting him.
Yeah. You know, I killed off a character in Buffalo Jump, not one of the main ones, but I adored her. I adored her. I thought she was such a wonderful person. And but at a certain point I said, yeah, she's got to go. And a couple of people said to me, I can't believe you killed her.
You Game of Thrones her.
Yeah. In the third book, I did something to Jonah's partner. And my editor at Random House called me and said, like, I just want to know that you've thought about this, because you're putting her through something pretty terrible. I said, trust me, I know she's on medical leave when the fourth book begins. And that was enough for her. She said, fine, as long as I know you've thought this through. Because it was definitely a bad experience. One thing we sometimes talk about in classes, and I've heard from other people, I don't know if you know Linwood Barkley, but he's a thriller writer who's just had phenomenal success, and he's based in Toronto now. And he started with a series, but now he writes standalones. And he and other people have said, with a standalone, you can take them to the nth of an inch of their life, because they're not coming back in the next book. Like you can burn down their house, and you can really bring them to death's door. The way it's a little harder in a series, if you know, unless it's one of those series where the guy is almost killed in every single book, you know, which can be funny. But I think you do have to put your characters through the ringer. You have to challenge yourself and challenge them, because that's what makes them heroes. You know, to use that phrase, you know, the more you pressure them and the more you force them outside their comfort zone, the more they reveal through the action they take to, you know, get around. And that's the other thing that theater teaches you. For every objective, there must be an obstacle, right? I want something, I can't get that thing because someone's in my way. What am I willing to do to get them out of my way? And that's how you reveal character.
Yeah. I remember one acting coach that I had said, in every single scene, you know, there's the macro sense of needs and wants for the entire story, but each scene, each character has needs and wants, and they have a goal, and their entire dialogue should be dictated based on meeting the needs of that goal. And if you put up a wall against them, they will find a way around. What is your dialogue version of that? You know, so
I went to a panel once where Ian Rankin, the Scottish writer, was interviewing Peter Robinson, a British author who transplanted to Toronto. And he said to Peter, I notice in your books, people have very strong needs. And Peter said, I'll never forget this. Anytime I see the word want, I scratch it out and I write need. I don't want a drink. I need a drink. Right? So you want your characters to have profound needs and desires. And then when they're thwarted, action.
I don't think anybody's ever been interested in a story where somebody is pursuing something that they could live without.
That's right. That's right.
You know?
Every rom-com, right,
Yeah.
is like that. If they felt, you know, iffy about the
Mhm.
character, who would care? It
There's a
has to
yeah.
be, balls to the wall, head
Yeah.
over heels love.
There's a song by the musical comedian Tim Minchin, where he sings a love song. He writes a love song to his wife, who was his high school sweetheart, and it was called "If I Didn't Have You." And the first line is, "If I didn't have you, I'd probably have somebody else."
Well, I can guess
Which
where he slept that night.
yeah, which is great. You're probably not going to make it on Hallmark, but
Yeah.
um, now we've gone through the 4 books of the Jonah Geller series. Now, your latest one I want to talk about is The American Zone. Now, this is a pretty different shift from the series that you've done before. Can you explain a little bit about what The American Zone is?
So it's a novel about the building of the Panama Canal, uh, about an 8-month period in 1906, which was when the project kind of got on track. It had struggled for the first year, year and a half, but was also the deadliest year of the American effort. More people died in 1906 than any other year of the construction.
Mm,
After that, it got better, and it is very different from anything I've done.
mhm,
Historical fiction. It is still, a crime novel. There is a crime that occurs, and
mhm,
one of the protagonists is a member of the Canal Zone Police because they had
mhm,
their own police force. So I don't know if all your readers would know this or your listeners, but the United States signed a treaty with Panama that gave them a 50-mile strip from ocean to ocean, 10
mhm,
miles wide. So 500 square miles was American territory. And they
mhm,
had American justice, American police, American racism.
mm.
And, you know, I, I, I had never thought about Panama. I had never given it 2 minutes thought.
Yeah.
And one day I didn't have much on my schedule, and I love watching documentaries. I
Mhm,
always just find a great documentary is a wonderful way to spend a couple of hours. And I happened to watch one about Panama and the building of the canal, and it was so fascinating. The characters, the real people that built it, from Teddy Roosevelt, the
mhm,
engineer John Stevens, the doctor
mhm.
who got rid of yellow fever so that people could
Yep.
work more safely. But the black workers came by the thousands from Barbados, Martinique, some from Jamaica and other places to work
Mhm,
for half of what white workers would get, but better than
mhm,
they could get at home. But they
mhm,
had terrible working conditions, very dangerous jobs. They died of disease, of accidents, of suicide. They ran away. And white workers really had a kind of utopian setup. They got
mhm.
great money, great benefits. Like, people today don't get all those benefits.
Yeah.
And so and again, this goes to research. The more I read, the more I thought, okay, I think this is the story here. So there are 2 protagonists in the American Zone. One is white, one is black. One came from San Francisco, which was destroyed by an earthquake that year, and one came from Barbados. And
Mm,
because one is white and one is black, they are treated so differently.
mhm,
But the young black man, Asa, commits a crime, and Jack, who's the zone police officer, winds up hunting him,
mhm,
and coming to believe that the whole thing is really unjust and Asa deserves better than life in prison, which is
yeah,
probably what he's looking at. And
sure.
so it's a story of how these 2 men kind of find each other, first as opposites, then as friends. And Teddy Roosevelt visited Panama that year,
Mm.
and he was the first president ever to leave the country while in office.
Wow.
Nobody had ever done it.
Wow.
You couldn't
Yeah.
tell Teddy Roosevelt what to do.
Yeah.
So he decamped for Panama and did an inspection, partly to raise morale, and he had enemies in the press who were painting it as a failure. He needed to win over the public. He needed to win over Congress. and really get support, American support, behind the canal. And going back to what you were talking about earlier, this is where being an observer, a bit of an outsider helps. Being Canadian and not having any skin in the game, I
Mm-hmm.
think allowed me to look at this project both with awe, in a way, of
Mm-hmm.
how phenomenal an accomplishment it was, but not ignoring the dark side of it that basically allowed it to succeed, which was
Mm-hmm.
cheap labor, expendable labor, disposable labor. And if they died, more came.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, sir, as an American, I am, for one, glad that all controversies surrounding the Panama Canal are over. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A friend of mine
um,
said you should write your next book in Greenland.
yeah, I honestly thought that this couldn't have been a more timely topic to talk about, but it also is a testament to setting in location.
Absolutely.
Writing, placing something in a time and space, not just because it looks cool, because it looks like Boston or Manhattan, but because it needs to take place there.
There's a story here that needs to be told, and maybe has been told, certainly in nonfiction. There are
Hmm.
plenty of academics that write about it, but there haven't been many novels, certainly not of late. There's one I
Hmm.
know that came out last year, I believe, called The Great Divide.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there's a kind of adventure one called The Saboteur or something like that. But, we can only write the stories that grab us.
Hmm.
And this was the story, after doing a lot of research. This was the story that I felt had to be told.
Yeah. Yeah. I know Lin-Manuel Miranda had the same feeling when he watched the Thomas Jefferson documentary. So I expect no less than a 3-hour long rap about the Panama Canal.
You know,
If that does
for
not hit Broadway by 2026, then we have an
Yeah.
issue.
Well, I think it actually would make a great film or TV series, but that's out of my
It
hands
prob
right now.
it probably would. I no doubt that I would. Now, realistic fiction, especially historical realistic fiction, how much are you as a writer willing to suspend disbelief? How much are you willing to stretch people's ability to, I guess, overlook some sort of fictional concept?
No, I didn't. I didn't very much. I mean, the real stories were so gripping and
Hmm.
fantastic that
Hmm.
most of what is in the book is
Hmm.
accurate. I'm not a
Yep.
historian. I'll
Hmm.
say that. I'm a storyteller, but I did my homework.
Hmm.
Now, every once in a while, I might have changed the timeline of something, made it a couple of
Hmm.
months earlier or later, uh,
Hmm.
to suit the timeline. But
Hmm.
everything I wrote, uh, I would kind of, you know,
Yeah.
swear to pretty
Yep.
much. Now, it does happen sometimes. When I wrote my book about Boston, I needed a trolley stop where there wasn't one. So I
Mm.
invented one, and I put a
Hmm.
note in. I said, alert readers will know there is no trolley stop on the Green Line called Summit Path, but I
Gotcha.
made one up.
Yep.
So deal with it. Uh,
But you even alluded to that in the fact that one of your editorial struggles in your past book was due to not being able to make the finances work out. And I
yeah,
think you've alluded in other interviews that there are things that you want your students to really have down in terms of procedures, not
yeah,
things like
yeah,
not moving a body without a medical examiner. So there are some things that are set in stone, and then there are
yeah.
some things that are able to be stretched a little. Do you
Of
have
course.
any examples as to things that you can kind of suspend disbelief over?
Well, sure. Like, think of any cop you've ever seen on TV. They
Hmm.
always break the rules, whether it's
Yep.
Bosch, Reacher, going
Hmm.
back to NYPD Blue and Hill Street Blues and all those other great shows. But they know
Yeah.
the rules, right? They
Yep.
know the rules. And someone says, hey, you can't do that. So I
Hmm.
think as long as the reader knows that what is
Hmm.
supposed to be done, you can get away with, you know, doing something different.
Yeah.
Um, so, and as I said before, things don't have to be real; they have to be plausible. You
Yeah.
and that goes to character as well as
Hmm.
stage business. You have to believe that this character would do it. You have to believe that, they might get caught.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, I think that's why it's so important to do your homework, not only so you'll have that, realistic,
Mm-hmm.
or that you don't require so much suspension of disbelief, but research also gives you plot ideas, character
Mm-hmm.
ideas. I
Yeah.
didn't know that there was a Canal Zone police force until I did my reading. And then I
Yeah.
said, well, that's what Jack will do. He'll join the police. And then once
Yeah.
he joined the police, oh, well, maybe this other character will run afoul of the police and then they'll chase
Mm-hmm.
each other and blah, blah, blah. So
Yeah.
half of this stuff, half of the things I did in the book, oh, Teddy Roosevelt went there in November. Well, that'll be kind of the climax building up to his visit. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
Cases of dynamite used to go missing. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
there's a plot idea. One of the first books I read, called Silver People, because the black workers got paid in silver, not gold, had a footnote at the back about anarchists in the zone, because they were
Okay.
importing workers from Spain and Cuba, and there were anarchists. And I went,
Yeah.
aha. I never would have known that without
Yeah.
reading that book, which put
Mm-hmm.
me in touch with a professor at Penn State who had written, the book on anarchists in Cuba and the Caribbean Basin, and we
Mm-hmm.
corresponded. So, it's another thing I advise people to do. If you read a
Yeah.
book and you like it, and the
Mm-hmm.
author's still alive, get in touch.
Yeah.
Or, call the media relations department of a police force, of a hospital, of whatever, because, sources like to talk. They're flattered when you say, I'm a writer, I'm writing a book, I'd love to talk to you about something.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
I get a lot of my
absolutely.
information from sources as well as reading.
Mhm. I love the results that you got from that research, because in doing so, you not only ground yourself in a new realm of plausibility, but you also set yourself up with a timeline
Yeah,
between now and when Teddy Roosevelt actually arrives.
that's right.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
start with the
Incredible.
earthquake, which was April 18th,
Mhm.
and basically go up until about November 17th.
Yeah.
And that was also on the advice of a historian I interviewed. She said, don't try to write about the whole canal. You'll like, it's too much. Narrow
Yeah.
your focus. And I
Mhm.
said, what do you advise? She said 1906,
Wow.
and gave me the reasons why. And then I said
Sure.
to her, what would have been on Roosevelt's mind? That wasn't so much her wheelhouse, but she gave me some ideas of where to look, and I
Mhm.
did. And I found there were certain things very much on his mind when he came to
Mhm.
Panama,
Mhm.
problems he had that he had to deal with. So it helped make him a more real character. And I loved writing about him.
Mhm.
Um, one thing I'll say, and I know we may be running short on time, I wish there were more politicians like Theodore Roosevelt around today, because
Yeah.
he wanted to build things up. He
Mhm.
wanted to do. He was a tremendous man of just tremendous energy and vision and political skills, and he put all of that to work in the name of public service. He was wealthy. He was born
Mhm.
wealthy. He didn't need to make money off the presidency. He wanted to give back, and he did. And
Yeah.
I just wish there were more people now who wanted to build great things like the canal,
Yeah.
um, and not tear them down.
Yeah. Absolutely. You were preaching to the choir on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
You got me with that last make money off the presidency. That's timely. Quick few questions. Just want to get your opinion on these. They're really, I think, important for listeners who are starting out in the new in writing, not entirely sure where to go. Some basic tips, some basic suggestions. So, you as an educator, what's one thing that you can't stand to see in a manuscript that just causes you to toss aside, takes you out of the story?
Well,
What's
I would
something like that?
say when I can see that the person has not done their homework, when they're
Sure.
writing about something that they clearly don't understand, or they write something like St. Louis, 1980, but there's
Hmm.
not one thing in the manuscript that shows me that
Yeah.
this is St. Louis 1980. And if
Hmm.
they hadn't written that, I wouldn't have known where or when. So
Yeah.
The devil's in the details, and the more detailed and specific a writer can be about the time and the place, the better I feel about it.
Over time, any tips on how you've learned to hook a reader within the first few pages?
That's a tough one, because I
Yeah.
always tell them they have to. How you
Mhm.
do it, I think, is character. Get people
Mhm.
interested in a person and their dilemma.
Mhm.
You were talking about people's desires and their needs. I think if you start a story showing, again, not telling,
Mm.
as we
Yeah.
always say, showing a person in need, in trouble, in a situation that, we're curious about people. I think
Right.
everyone is born with a certain bit of curiosity, and we're curious about other people. And I think if there's anything you can do, it doesn't have to be, gun play. And I see a lot of writers now want to start the book with a huge bang,
Yeah.
then it's like 1 week earlier, and they build back up to where they're going, and you see it on a million TV shows. It
Oh, yeah.
seems to be quite a trend now. But I think human nature, somebody in trouble, somebody in a unique,
Mhm.
and a great voice,
Mhm.
a voice that carries the story, that suits the material. If it's a funny situation, a funny voice. If it's not a funny situation, a dramatic
Mhm.
voice, but something unique, personal.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I can speak from professional experience when writing screenplays for action films. That is almost a characteristic must, starting with a big bang and then 1 week earlier. And
Yeah. Yeah.
I've always viewed that over time as a testament to the shortening of attention spans. Have you
Yes.
noticed that in your time as a writer?
100%.
So
100%.
how do you address that from a writing perspective? If the window to hook your readers gets shorter and shorter, how do we as writers,
You know,
let's combat that?
Yeah, I might not be the best person to ask, because I still feel a little bit old school. But I did
Mhm,
start the American Zone with a prologue. It's not like a shoot 'em up, but it's Roosevelt arriving in Panama. Jack
mhm,
is my cop character is in plain clothes in the crowd, watching for anything untoward. Also, kind of thinking of what he has to do to get Roosevelt's help
mhm.
in getting this kid Asa out of prison. So I dropped the reader a little bit into one of those, and then 4 months
Yeah.
earlier, um, but I'm getting closer to the end of my career than I am to the beginning of it, obviously,
Sure.
and I don't know how the market, what it's going to look like in a few years. Will
Mhm.
people just be writing short flash fiction? I keep hearing that kids in university do not want to read novels, like
There
that
are
they're,
kids in high school who can't.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
It's yeah, it's that's a whole we could go on for another 5 hours if we wanted
yeah,
for on that
yeah,
topic.
yeah.
But yeah. Um, well, Howard, it's been amazing having you on. I thank you so much for your time this afternoon, taking time to answer the questions. We like to leave the audience with one recommendation. What are you reading right now? What's something that you couldn't go without?
Okay, so a friend of mine in New York asked
Mhm,
me if I had read the book that inspired the series Slow Horses, which is on Apple TV, about a bunch of British spies who've been exiled to this new department for screw ups. They've all done something, and they're not being fired, but they are being, it's almost like constructive dismissal. And
mhm,
Slough House is where they now work.
mhm.
And that's where the nickname Slow Horses came from. There are maybe 7 or 8
Ah,
books in the series by Mick Herron, and they are funny. They are really quite unique. They're not like any, espionage novels. I was a huge John le Carre fan. I love John le Carre, and I've read almost all of his
mhm,
books. This is really quite different, and he does things with point of view that are
mhm,
unique, the point of view of the rain, of dawn, of sunset. Like he just let her rip. So I've sadly come to the end. So I guess I'll have to wait for him to read something, write something new, whatever. But we'll see what my next read is. But I've just finished those, and they were great.
Absolutely. We'll definitely check those out and leave links to them down below. Howard, where can people find you?
HowardShrier.com, my website, and information about my books. I'll have a new class probably starting up soon, maybe in the fall, because I'm just winding one up now. But my website is the best place.
Award-winning author of The American Zone, Howard Shrier, thank you for your time.
Thank you.